and welcome to the sixth session of the series of the webinars organized by the Regional Office for Europe and Central Asia. Today's webinar is on impact of COVID-19 on seasonal and circular migration. This is a part of a series of regional COVID-19 webinars to facilitate a multi-stakeholder dialogue through knowledge sharing and exchange of experience among relevant actors in the countries in Europe and Central Asia region. My name is Navarre Lorian, and I am a program specialist at the Regional Office for Europe and Central Asia in Budapest, and I'm very pleased to moderate today's session. Before starting the webinar, I would like to present some technical details for you. The webinar is going to be in two languages, English and Russian. So I would like to remind you about the interpretation function below on the bottom with the sign of the globe. So please make sure to change the channel depending on which language you want to in which language you want to follow this webinar. Also, I would like to ask our speakers and panelists to mute their microphones if they are not speaking. And the last point is regarding the questions and answers session, which we will have at the end of this, at the end of the webinar. Please make sure to send your questions and comments in the Q&A box on the bottom and not in the chat, so that we can collect all your questions and comments, and later our panelists and speakers will address them. So now for opening remarks, I am pleased to give the floor to Raimund Jelle. He is the regional program leader at in REU. Raimund, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Navarre. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, friends, dear participants, dear distinguished speakers, panelists. It's an honor to welcome you to this FAO 6th regional webinar on COVID-19 in Europe and Central Asia, focusing on the impact of COVID on seasonal and circular migration. The current webinar is part of our series of webinars facilitating a multi-stakeholder dialogue on the impact of COVID through knowledge sharing and exchange of experience amongst relevant actors in the countries of the region. It's a pleasure for myself that we are restarting after the summer break, and we will discuss migration today. But in the coming weeks, we will also put a spotlight on trade, food loss and waste, climate change, digitalization in light of the COVID pandemic in our region. I think the seminar today on seasonal migration highlights really how internal and international migrants contribute to agriculture and rural development in many ways, not only by sending remittances or transferring knowledge to their home countries, but also by working in agriculture food systems in the destination area. The pandemic, as we know, and we have discussed, and many webinars are happening these days, or have been also happening in the past months, really put the spotlight on many different aspects, but it definitely puts the spotlight how vital contribution migrants are in terms of also the food supplies. Following the enforced border restrictions and the adoption of lockdown measures, which we have experienced, there are serious impacts on the seasonal and the circular mobility process of the migrants. Some of the points which I just want to quickly highlight: many migrants were unable to reach the work, as well as the closure or downsizing of businesses resulted in job losses and maybe also suspending of foreign labor supply. We have seen this in Western European countries, that suddenly with the border closing, there became a problem in this case. Many migrant workers also needed to return to the rural areas of origin with, in that sense, no earnings accumulated or alternative employment opportunities inside. The inability to travel put, of course, also pressure on the local markets, and maybe increase of unemployment. And on the other hand, it showed also that the development countries are heavily dependent on migrant workers, and it put a spotlight also on the situation of some of the migrant workers. I am sure you remember also in some of the EU countries, suddenly in the meat industry, there became problems because of hygienic and many other issues. So some of these points mentioned can severely influence the food security situation in some of the countries of the region, and also halting of plans to productivity investment, and the remittances are usually also going to be used, and this can of course also cause a worsening of the rural households' ability to sustain a steady livelihood, and further deepening and further deepening, of course, also the rural poverty. I think in light of this, the webinar today will really facilitate the exchange of experience, as all our webinars so far are trying really to facilitate this, because the COVID is still in many ways also something which we do not know fully all the impacts. And we want to see how governments are coping with and mitigating the COVID-19 impacts following seasonal and circular labor migration disruptions, the unemployment, the labor supply challenges, and of course also opportunities in ensuring the food security, migrants, rural households, and also the regional outlook on the effective usage of savings from the remittances. So I'm very happy to welcome the keynote speakers from the World Bank, ILO, IOM, and to see also here the highlights, and to put in principle the emphasis on some of these issues. And so the webinar in that sense is going to be probably giving also a way for lessons learned from the pandemic, and we can certainly build our programs in that sense. So the introduction presentation will be followed by a panel discussion where we are looking for good examples how the impacts of COVID pandemic were affecting migrant workers. I mean, good examples in the sense that what are the measures in order to reduce the negative impacts, particularly in the case of Central Asia, Moldova, and also the Russian Federation. And so I'm very much looking forward to an interesting debate and a discussion. So thank you very much. Welcome again, and over to you, Naward.
Thank you very much, Raimund, and thank you for welcoming remarks and also for setting the scene so well. So we are ready to start with our first presentation, and our first speaker is going to be from the International Organization of Migration, Michael Newson. Michael, thank you very much again for accepting our invitation to participate in this webinar. I would like to present Michael. He works in IOM Regional Office in Vienna as the Senior Regional Thematic Specialist for Labor Mobility and Human Development for the Southeastern Europe, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia region. He is responsible for providing technical support, policy expertise, capacity building, and training to governments, IOM officials, and other relevant stakeholders through the region. He's going to talk about the specific challenges related to COVID-19 and circular migration that distinguish it from other forms of mobility. And he will also present us future prospects for seasonal migration, efforts towards reopening circular migration, and opportunities to improve worker conditions in the process. Thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Naward, for that introduction. I'm not sure I'll be able to get to all of that within my allotted 10 minutes, but I'll do my best. First of all, thank you, Raymond, Naward, and FAO for inviting me to participate in this interesting discussion. I'm going to use my time. I'm going to be citing data from 3 different surveys that we have the results of. There hasn't really been any sort of comprehensive studies yet on the impacts of COVID-19 on labor migration, but there have been certain surveys and studies that have been done. So I'll be looking at one survey that was done by the Migration and Ethnicity Research Group at RANEPA in Moscow, which looked at over 500 Uzbek and Kyrgyz migrants, as well as over 400 Russian respondents in the Russian Federation. Another survey by the Institute of Socio-Political Research, again looking at migrant workers in the Russian Federation. And then a survey that was conducted by IOM of over 1,000 Moldovan migrant workers living in Russia and the EU. And the results of this are really quite indicative of what we've been seeing or hearing anecdotally about the impacts of COVID-19 on labor migration more generally. So I think there are sort of maybe three key points that will come out throughout this presentation, assuming I have the time. But the first is that what the data makes clear is that migrants have been disproportionately impacted by the lockdown and the economic downturn that occurred. So in the RENEPA survey in the Russian Federation, we found that 40% of migrant workers lost their jobs and 35% more were required to take unpaid vacation. This is somewhat higher than came out in other surveys, but the data is still indicates high job losses and high rates of unpaid leave compared to Russian workers. For example, the statistics for Russian workers were only 23% and 25% respectively. So significantly higher for migrant workers than for Russian nationals. IOM survey of Moldovan migrant workers indicated 47% had lost their jobs. So again, an extremely high rate of job loss among migrant workers. Obviously, there could be many reasons for this. A large part of it is simply that migrants tend to be engaged in occupations that were disproportionately impacted by the lockdown. So in the ISPR survey, they found that the occupations most impacted were construction, restaurants and cafes, retail trade, and taxi drivers. And those tend to be occupations and sectors that have high rates of migrant employment. But another thing to note is that in many cases, this won't necessarily be a short-term slump for specific sectors. So while some sectors obviously can bounce back quite quickly after the lockdown, other sectors are going to be impacted by longer term patterns in terms of people's changes of routines and changes in consumer behavior. What a lot of economists have been pointing out is that this is not necessarily a slump in overall demand, but rather a decline in supply, or supply able to meet the safety requirements of demand. So we're seeing that people who might have been, for example, going to restaurants or going to shows are simply shifting their consumption to other sectors, mainly to say household decoration or things like that, things that they consider more safer to consume during the pandemic. So some sectors, and particularly those sectors that tend to employ high numbers of migrants, are likely to see longer term downturns in the labor market over the long term. Shifting more towards agriculture though, the agricultural sector is somewhat immune to this shift. I mean, restaurants may have reduced their purchasing of, but obviously supermarkets have seen increases in consumption. I think all of us, even from our own personal experiences during lockdown, recognize that food consumption has definitely not gone down over this period. So demand for agricultural and food products is and will remain very strong. And as a result, the agricultural labor market is really somewhat unique compared to other labor markets in terms of the impact of COVID-19. Even different from other seasonal occupations such as tourism and hospitality, which obviously have seen declines. We just simply haven't seen that in agriculture. So the demand for the product has not been impacted, but also the seasonality, the geography, and the nature of the work mean that we're going to see very little shift of unemployed nationals from one sector into the agricultural sector. So the demand for migrant workers remains as high as ever, if not higher, despite all the mobility restrictions that we've seen. And this is even recognized by migrant workers themselves. In the survey that we did of Moldovan migrant workers, for example, a number of them noted that the majority of the sectors have been affected, but they all noted the food sector has not been impacted in terms of the labor demand. The second point to make is that many migrants who have been impacted by this are simply playing the sort of waited out game, either in the country of destination or the country of origin, with the expectation that eventually things will get back to normal and they'll have their jobs back. So in both surveys in Russia, the majority of workers intended to remain in Russia. And we saw this with IOM survey as well. Only 30% of Moldovan migrant workers intended to return to Moldova. So instead, many are taking the opportunity to either wait it out in the country of destination, and in these circumstances are either burning through sort of limited savings that they had, and also relying on social networks, often within the migrant community, to make ends meet as they wait out and look for employment opportunities. Even in those returning to the country of origin, a lot of them are trying to play the waited out game, and intend to return or to remigrate in the near future. Only 30% of the Moldovans who plan to return expected to remain in Moldova for a longer period. So this strategy of waiting it out, while it's extremely common and to a certain extent understandable, can be very risky and can be very wasteful as well. Rather than taking advantage of the opportunity to use their savings towards a venture or an initiative that can potentially provide a long-term alternative to migration and provide livelihood opportunities, often we see migrants burning through their savings, and then over the course of the remaining months, struggling to figure out what to do. And there can be also longer-term impacts from a psychological and social perspective when migrants face long-term unemployment. So to address this, governments need to put in place policies and programs that encourage more productive use of remittances and savings among remittance recipients, but also among returnees. Programs to incentivize the use of savings towards, say, sustainable livelihoods that can reduce waste and can encourage consumer demand within communities of origin as well. So as concrete examples, sort of loan or lending or matching grant programs, as well as technical support programs that can encourage returnees to invest savings in livelihood opportunities that can also help to stimulate local economic activity, which will be needed, particularly when we consider the likelihood of reduced remittances coming from migrants abroad. We saw also in the Moldova survey that I believe it was 26% of people who had intended to return to Moldova indicated that they did have savings to invest. So developing programs that incentivize this use of savings towards productive investments in livelihoods can go a long way in addressing some of these issues. I recognize I'm short on time, but I'll continue to the third point. My third point is that safely reopening labor migration opportunities is a win-win proposition that countries of origin and countries of destination should be seeking to develop, but it will require a lot more coordination than what we've seen in the past. What we've seen in some cases that governments are simply sitting and waiting for business as usual to reappear when it comes to border openings. And that's not the way that this is going to happen. COVID-19, because of COVID-19, labor mobility currently obviously entails a greater degree of public health risk than it did 1 year ago. So as a result, the mobility systems that existed a year ago that people thought were safe and acceptable won't be so for the foreseeable future. There's a need to, as people have been saying, health-proof labor migration systems going forward, which will require a lot more work in pre-departure and a lot more coordination between countries of origin and countries of destination, not only to make sure that the system is safe, but also to build trust between partners in countries of origin and countries of destination that systems are working effectively. That's my alarm telling me that I've met my 10 minutes. But if you don't mind, I'll wrap up here then. But at the same time, I think we need to use this opportunity. I think it would be a mistake if we simply went back to business as usual with enhanced health proofing of migration. We know that there were significant problems with the systems that existed before when it comes to labor migration, with abuses in recruitment or abuses within employment and working conditions, particularly for low-skilled workers. but also particularly in the agricultural sector. So we need to use this opportunity not only to improve the health screening, but to improve overall oversight of recruitment conditions and employment conditions for migrant workers. And I think that to end it on the agricultural sector, the agricultural sector has a real opportunity to lead on reforming the recruitment process here. Because of the nature of the industry and the labor market, where we're likely to see large-scale opportunities for labor migration within the agricultural sector before we're going to see that for any other sector, simply because of the demand for it, which we see not going down in the way that we will in other industries and other sectors. So because agriculture will probably be the first sector to see these openings and these opportunities, this is the sector in which we can set an example for how labor migration and labor mobility can be done safely, both from a health perspective, but also responding to some of the issues in terms of abuse that we've seen in the past when it comes to recruitment and employment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for presenting us the key findings and the risks, and also for highlighting the uniqueness of agricultural sector. Your recommendations and suggestions are also well taken, and thank you for a very interesting presentation. So now I would like to present our second speaker. We have a representative from World Bank, Mr. Dilip Ratta. Unfortunately, he was not able to participate in the webinar, but he kindly provided a recording of his speech. Mr. Dilip Ratta is lead economist, migration and remittances, and head of the Global Knowledge Partnership on Migration and Development. He is going to talk about a very important and interesting topic related to labor migration. It will be about declining remittances in the region of Europe and Central Asia and the implications on the households. I would like to ask my colleagues to start the recording. Thank you.
Sorry, I couldn't be there in person, but here is a video recording of what I wanted to say. I wanted to thank the regional office of FAO for inviting me to this session. Remittance flows to low and middle income countries last year reached a milestone. They actually exceeded the flow of foreign direct investment flows to low and middle income countries. Remittance flows in 2019 reached $554 billion, and that is only recorded remittance flows. So the true size is even larger. So with that milestone, now a large number of countries are highly dependent on remittances, and it is really a matter of concern that COVID-19 crisis might cause a significant fall in these flows, which are a lifeline to poor countries, poor households. And just to highlight the importance of remittances globally, we know that India, China, Mexico are the large remittance recipients in dollar volume, but Ukraine shows up from the ECA region. Ukraine shows up in number 10 with about $16 billion in remittance receipts per year in 2019, that is. But as a percentage of GDP, once you control for the size of the economy, then actually countries like Tajikistan, Nepal, Montenegro, these countries actually have remittances that are about equivalent to 1/3 or a quarter of the GDP of these countries. So with that level of dependence, clearly any risks to remittances in terms of a fall are going to cause a lot of difficulties to a large number of households in these countries. So if we then look at specifically the ECA region, the 5 top recipients in 2019 were Ukraine, Russia, Romania, Serbia, Uzbekistan. But again, as you have seen before, the top 10 countries in terms of remittances as a share of GDP, each of them have over 10% of the GDP as remittances. And indeed, for Kyrgyz Republic, Tajikistan, and Montenegro, the share of remittances in GDP is significant. It's over a quarter of the national income of these countries. The COVID-19 crisis, when it began and we had the lockdown, the social distancing, the disruptions to travel in late March, it seemed like it was going to be short-lived, and that's what a lot of analysts said. But the fact is that the crisis hasn't gone away. We have not gotten back to normal. We're trying very hard all over the world, and yet we haven't gotten back to normal. What is even more worrisome this time is that the spread of the virus has been simultaneous and global. So whether we talk about Washington, D.C. or Budapest, or we talk about a village in India or in Africa, everywhere there is a worry about staying safe. So there are lockdowns at all levels and disruptions to business and economic activities and personal hardships everywhere. And now millions of people have already been affected. Now, we did a comparison of the COVID-19 crisis way back in late March, actually. We did a comparison of the current crisis with other pandemics like SARS and Ebola. Now, with SARS and Ebola, what was clear was that it wasn't that widespread. But in the case of Ebola in particular, we noticed that when some Western African countries suffered from Ebola, migration from there to outside was not possible. It was just the migrants from there were not welcome. But also relatives didn't go back home to help the family back home because it just didn't make sense. So they sent actually more money home. So remittances went up, and they provided a lifeline, literally, to families that were affected by, let's say, Ebola, or economies that were impacted by that. The current crisis is different in the sense that it is also affecting not only it is affecting beneficiary country, recipient countries for remittances. It is also affecting source countries for remittances, like the United States or United Kingdom. And we saw that kind of effect during the the global financial crisis in 2009, when remittances fell by 5%, actually only 5%, and compare that with the fall in foreign direct investment of about 30%, about 1/3. So remittances fell and they quickly bounced back. That was 2009. Now, this time, the crisis has been much worse and is going to have much more deeper and pervasive impacts on remittance flows. So big question is, when will we recover from the crisis? And this is why I have left this slide on about the experience from the Spanish flu of about 100 years ago. It is instructive to see that the Spanish flu actually had 3 distinct phases, and the deadliest phase was in October 1918, October, November, in the run-up to Christmas. That is the second phase, and we should not rule out that there would be a second phase of infections and mortality because of the current crisis. And also to note that the Spanish flu didn't go away until actually 2020. So it lasted for 2 years with some seriousness. And for 1 year, it was really serious. The current crisis might have a similar trajectory. We can't rule that out. And when a virus, when the vaccine is found, maybe that's when things will begin to improve. So that has enormous impacts for how we project economic growth and economic activities and employment levels for migrant workers, and workers in general, and then on remittance flows. So we projected in April that remittance flows would fall by 20% to all low and middle income countries, but to Europe and Central Asia, the fall would be even larger, about 27% decline. And that was because in ECA region, there is a distinct reliance on migration to Russia and remittance flows from Russia. And because the Russian economy is so dependent on oil prices, on top of the general economic slowdown that we have seen because of the COVID-19 lockdowns and shutdowns, it's also oil price has become lower because of the economic crisis, and with lower oil prices, Russian economy has been hit even harder. So that is a second reason. So the first reason for a fall in remittances is low economic growth or negative economic growth in source countries. Second reason is low oil prices, and because of that, even lower economic growth in Russia. And finally, also the ruble is weakening against the US dollar. And when you express remittances in dollar terms, let's say remittances to Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan in dollar terms, if the money has come in ruble terms and ruble depreciates against the dollar, then remittances to Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan in US dollar terms become even lower. That's the reason we had a sharp projection of a sharp decline in remittance flows to Europe and Central Asia region. What has been the reality? The reality in the first quarter of 2020 and the second quarter of 2020 are shown in this slide. The yellow line is year-on-year growth rate in the first quarter, and the blue line is showing year-on-year growth rate in remittance flows from Russia to different countries in the second quarter. And you can see that the total remittance flows from Russia declined by over 18%, 18.6% in the second quarter. And the CIS countries, the decline was 28.5%. In countries like Kyrgyzstan, the decline in remittances in the second quarter was 45% after a fall of 22% in Q1. So there is a significant risk that remittances to the ECA region are falling. And if there is a pickup more recently, it is actually much more because of the pent-up demand to send money, pent-up demand to receive money. Because of the disruption during April, May, June, people couldn't send money because money transfer companies were really short, and now money is flowing back again a little bit, but it is really temporary. In the end, employment levels of migrants has been impacted, and their ability to keep sending money has been weakened significantly. So if the crisis continues, then we are looking at serious hardships to people. So what can be done in terms of policy responses? The first policy, first recommendation is obviously that when we take care of the population in general in a country, we also should take care of migrant workers. And this time, it's not only because migrant workers themselves need help, it is also because we want to also prevent any further infection coming from migrants to the native-born population. Taking care of stranded migrants is important. There is the need to provide access to health services, education, and housing for migrants in the host countries. Also in the sending communities back home, that is, in the developing countries mostly. Also, there is the need to provide access to migrants' families to health and education and housing, and perhaps cash transfers. And finally, remittance service providers should be considered as essential service providers. They should be considered essential. That would help keep the remittance services open. And this is also the time when we know that digital remittances are getting more popular and they're actually safer purely from a contagion point of view. But one problem is that digital remittances are not accessible.
Sorry, I guess there is a small technical issue here. Just 1-2 minutes trying to fix this problem. Sorry, but I guess we cannot continue with the video. There is a technical issue. I guess we need to proceed with our next speaker. So I'm happy. First of all, thank you to Dilip for this very interesting presentation. It's really interesting to know especially the comparison with other pandemics so far, and what to expect also to follow after COVID. Also, it was interesting to hear about the reasons of declining remittances in the region, and also the policy recommendations. Thank you very much for this very interesting and detailed presentation. I'm happy to start now to present our next speaker, Ms. Fabiola Mieres. She is presenting the International Labour Organization. She is a technical officer in labor migration. Her main areas of expertise include labor recruitment, forced labor, labor standards in global supply chains, and temporary labor migration. Fabiola is going to talk about seasonal agricultural work in light of COVID-19. Fabiola, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me well. I would like to thank the FAO for the invitation, and also to thank my previous speakers, as my presentation fits very well with some of the issues that they raised as we are transitioning this pandemic. So my talk today is going to focus on work that we're doing at the ILO in rethinking the seasonal work in the context of the pandemic, but also taking into account that we're still going through the pandemic. So bearing in mind that it's very difficult to come up with the best policy recommendation at the same time as we're learning about the pandemic. And I think we're all very aware of this, and some level of recognition that governments and international organizations and everyone is doing the best they can in this very challenging and present circumstance. So we thought that it would be a good opportunity to really take stock of what these seasonal migration schemes have done for workers, governments, and of course, migrant workers themselves, and how they contribute to development. Some of the initial thinking and analysis that I will present today was published in a brief that I will share shortly after the presentation. And further work is going to be carried out also with FAO in Rome. I'm based in Geneva. So we really look forward to providing some elements in the rethinking of the policy design to make these schemes more effective and sustainable, not only for labor markets and societies, but for migrant workers themselves. So as my previous speakers also touched upon some of the issues, I won't go at length on how the total and partial closure of borders have really affected the economy and the interruption of global supply chains, particularly food supply chains in the agriculture sector. These have been impacted, bringing a lot of food security concerns, despite the high demand in food, as we know. And it really pointed to labor shortages in a lot of these labor markets, and showed us the high reliance on migrant workers in the agriculture sector, not only in Central Asia, but in other parts of the world. So it really casted a light on the historical and systemic difficult working conditions that some of these migrant workers are facing while they contribute essentially to our economies. So a lot of countries have relabeled the migrant workforce as essential workers. And so what this shape took, it's a closer look at the different short-term responses that some governments have put in place, have been that they tried, as these workers could not reach the destination countries, as it was previously mentioned, they tried to tap into the national workforce, creating all sorts of voluntary and incentive systems to attract workers. We saw cases in Germany, Australia, UK, for instance, but they have not been very successful. It's not very easy to turn on and off the tap of agricultural workers, as this is not really jobs that the local population really want to take up. So this was the first indication that we need to do something about the way in which these schemes are being designed. In the field of migration policy changes, we observed two main broad responses that went, for instance, first from visa extensions and exceptional admissions, so the organization of chartered flights, despite the lockdown, so that migrants could reach their destination. For instance, the extension of a green corridor between Italy and Romania. And even in the United States, migration was paused for 60 days. This also led to another debate on regularization plans and resorting to asylum seekers and refugees, for instance. There have been some issues around regularization with different modalities targeted at particular sectors, for instance, in Italy, in the agriculture sector and care work, with different variation in Portugal and Spain, and other countries are debating how to provide for amnesties and regularize the undocumented workers that are an important proportion of the workers that perform in these sectors. In some contexts, for instance, refugees who have not been historically allowed to work, they have been allowed to participate in the labor market. And in some cases, for instance, the interesting case of Russia that we might hear from the professor soon after, is basically allowing workers to work without permits, even such a radical approach, we can say, in that sense. So you can see that governments have been really trying to put in place measures to address these short-term shortages, if we can call it in that way. But the other issue that we learned from this ongoing pandemic is the systemic inequalities that these workers have historically been facing. And these inequalities manifest in a lot of different ways. They go from variegated gender dynamics, in the sense that most of the agricultural workers are men, but also women migrant workers, issues of harassment, taking care of the household. So this has also exposed a wide range of difference in payment systems in the agriculture sector that go from piece rates, for instance, some countries not subscribing to minimum wage laws, and workers really highly dependent on labor brokers or recruiters that manage the employment relationship, and that leads to different forms of abuses, and a lot of cases have been documented on this front. So this pandemic, as all the other speakers say, and I guess we continue to talk about this, really highlighted the contribution of migrant workers in the agriculture sector, not only to the sector in itself, but to societies in general. So at the ILO, in Rethinking the Future and what lessons so far we can actually extract from the design of these schemes, we have a few recommendations, which basically look at policy design and the importance of having a labor migration policy that puts into light the human-centered, rights-based approach. So the first point is to really embed the structural contribution of seasonal workers in national policy design. What I mean by this is try to avoid having parallel systems that bring workers to particular sectors, creating further market cementation that creates these inequalities, not only between nationals and migrants, but also within in-migrant groups. So really, now that we are thinking recovery in a lot of different aspects, embedding the migration policy in issues around, for instance, stimulating the economy, the fiscal policy, support to enterprises and job creation, the protection of migrant workers, and of course, relying in social partners. And I will talk a little bit more about that. This also brings a reconceptualization on the notion of skill. For a long time, migrant agricultural workers have been considered low-skilled workers. And maybe we can rethink what it means to have a low-skilled worker when you really know the crop, when you're really in touch with the reality of the season, and you actually know how to do the work. There's a lot of evidence that people who have led a very urban life cannot easily adapt to the work in the agricultural sector. So maybe we have to rethink policies of skill retention, training, prior learning recognition when we redesign these schemes and when we open these channels again. And this will lead, of course, to a better cooperation across borders between countries. And this really raises the issue of policy coherence again. And this is work that we might be starting with FAO in Rome on really bringing policy coherence between agriculture policies and migration policies so that they are really tailored to the needs of the labor markets and migrant workers themselves. The other point I would suggest is addressing the unequal wages and the differentiated payment systems that we see in a lot of different parts of the sector that also sometimes are tied to the different specific crops and the way that the migrants are integrated or not in the host economies. And the two last points that are very important is how to secure means of representation. As you know, the ILO is a tripartite organization of the United Nations, so we work with employer organizations, workers organizations, mostly trade unions and governments, to really try to bring to balance all these unequal playing level fields, but also very variegated interests. So having representation for these workers is important to bring workers to the table so that the policies are tailored to their needs also and their families. And this brings back my last point, which refers to social dialogue. Social dialogue mechanisms could be strengthened so that this, in the design and redesign of these schemes towards more sustainable flow of workers, workers and employers organizations are included in these discussions through the creation of forums and webinars. I know a lot already is going on in other international fora, but really creating institutional mechanisms and systems for these actors to take part in the design of the migration policies. Without I'm open to questions, and I will share some of these ideas that I presented very briefly today in light of time, also to hear more from the other actors in the seminar. I will end my presentation here, and I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Fabiola. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. It's also very important to know the experience of other governments, and it's very good that we will have also representatives from countries that they will also present their perspective on what has been presented, not only by you, but also by Michael and also by Dilip. My colleagues working behind the scene are trying to make sure that we have the final part of Mr. Rata's presentation. So we have just a couple of slides left to show, so we will continue with the recording now. Thank you.
The cost of sending money was already very high globally, 6.8%, in the ACA region 6.5%, more than double the level that has been targeted by these Sustainable Development Goals. And this phenomenon of high remittance costs actually is getting even more costly now. Remittance costs are increasing a bit because of the crisis right now. So there is a need to accelerate that process. So final point, remittances are actually dollars wrapped with care. Migration is a great way to escape poverty. Remittances are a great way of sharing prosperity, and we need to make remittances faster, cheaper, and more effective, and it can be done. Thank you.
So thank you again to Dilip for this very interesting presentation. Now I'm very happy to start with our panel discussion. I would like to invite the panelists to unmute their mics, and our panel discussion will be interventions from country representatives in the region on the issues derived from COVID-19 implications and adopted mitigation support measures for returning migrant workers. I'm pleased to introduce you to our three panelists. Ms. Saudat Olimova, she is the director of the Shark Research Center in Tajikistan. She is a former member of IMF Central Asia and Caucasus Advisory Group. I would like to mention that Ms. Olimova is going to present her speeches in Russian, so please make sure to change the channels while she is speaking. Our next panelist is Vasil Kandarji from Moldova. He is the project director of the Center of Sociological Investigations and Marketing Research in Moldova. He also previously held positions in the Council of Europe, UNDP, UNAIDS, and in other organizations. And our third panelist is Ms. Irina Ivachnyuk, doctor in economics, professor, associate in the Global Migration Policy Associates. She is also a member of the expert council attached to the Migration Directorate of the Ministry of Interior of the Russian Federation. So luckily, during this panel, we will have the chance also to hear from countries' perspectives. And I would like to start with our first question. And my first question is to Ms. Olimova. Ms. Olimova, could you please tell us what would be the main challenges in Central Asian countries for labor migrants and their families? Thank you. Ms. Olimova.
Спасибо. Что это? Слышно, да? Доброе утро всем. Я прежде всего хотела бы поблагодарить офис ФАО за приглашение на этот очень интересный вебинар. Я хотела сказать, что пандемия коронавируса нанесла серьезнейший удар по сезонной и временной миграции из стран Центральной Азии, Узбекистана, Таджикистана, Кыргызстана в Россию, где работает от 82 до 95% всех мигрантов из наших центральноазиатских стран. Поскольку коронакризис остановил работу многих мигрантов, то они в основном придерживаются трех стратегий. Вообще это результат наших исследований, потому что центр, которым я руковожу, его одна из основных направлений – это изучение трудовой миграции. И, в общем, я сейчас по итогам нескольких миграций такой общий вывод могу сказать, что в основном три стратегии те, кто остается в России. Первое – это любой ценой стремятся получить гражданство Российской Федерации и ищут любую работу и ждут там. Второе – это переходят работать и жить в теневой сектор в России, то есть неформальный рынок труда и нелегальная занятость и проживание. И третье – возвращается на родину, чтобы переждать плохие времена. И вот об этих я хотела бы сказать поподробнее. За первое полугодие 2020 года в Узбекистан вернулось около полумиллиона мигрантов. И остается в России более 2 миллионов граждан Узбекистана, которые сезонно работают. В Кыргызстан за это полугодие вернулись около 80 тысяч человек. Остается в России более 800 тысяч. В Таджикистан вернулись более 90 тысяч мигрантов. Остается около 1 миллиона. Но и косвенно это подтверждают данные другого исследования, согласно которому в июне в Таджикистане около 35% домохозяйств имели мигрантов в России. Но вот я считаю, что в Таджикистане, конечно, больше всего осталось в России, потому что меньше всего вариантов вывоза было трудовых мигрантов из Таджикистана в Россию. В Узбекистане правительство предприняло меры для того, чтобы хотя бы часть вывести, и в Кыргызстане тоже, а вот таджикистанцы застряли в России. Теперь вернувшиеся на работу мигранты сталкиваются с отсутствием работы и с невозможностью поехать в какую-то другую страну. И мы посмотрели по Таджикистану, количество выезжающих сезонников сократилось вот за первое полугодие по сравнению с 2019 годом от 30 до 57%. Это разные структуры, официальные дают разные оценки. Вот, на мой взгляд, 37% это наши данные. Что происходит с оставшимися мигрантами и их семьями, которые остаются они прибыли на родину или не могут выехать? Но понятно, что во всех странах Центральной Азии отмечается рост безработицы, сокращение экономической активности населения, падение доходов, рост бедности. Например, в июне более 41% домохозяйств в Таджикистане сократили потребление продуктов питания. Но это связано с сокращением переводов. Я не буду на этом останавливаться, потому что прекрасная была презентация.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Olimova. Regarding the remittances, I have prepared the second question for you, so we'll also talk about the remittances a bit later. So now I would like to ask Ms. Irina Ivakhnuk about the experience in Russia as a recipient country. What are some evidences from Russia as a recipient country of many labor migrants from Central Asia regarding the impact of pandemic? Grateful if you could present us.
Mentioned that two groups of labor migrants have been affected by COVID-19 implications. Those who were unable to travel to countries of destination to work and stayed without earnings at home, and those who got stuck in countries of employment, often without work, without earnings, and without possibility to return home. I see my task here to present the standpoint of a country of destination, namely Russia, regarding legal situation of those migrant workers who have been staying at the territory of Russia during the pandemic, and also modes of their adaptation to the challenges related to anti-COVID-19 measures. Michael mentioned the surveys which were conducted by RRM in the Russian Federation recently and were aimed to clarify the impact of COVID-19 on employment of migrant workers in Russia. I didn't know about these surveys, and at first I was regret about that, but maybe the idea is good, because in my presentation I will base on other sources, on some official statistical data which is available for the moment, also the analysis of information from media, and my personal contacts with migrants communities leaders. So due to different sources of information, some conclusions of my and of Michael will not coincide, so don't be surprised. The first thing I am to say is that an overwhelming majority of migrant workers did not leave Russia during the pandemic. Some of them did, some of them would like to, but they had no possibility due to closed borders. And the others, wittingly with their eyes open, decided to wait out the crisis here. For example, up to information from Kyrgyzstan, only 30,000 Kyrgyz workers returned home from Russia between April and September. It's a very small amount, about 4% in comparison with 800,000 Kyrgyz labor migrants who are employed in Russia. Please, slide one. Slide one, yes. Number of arrivals of CIS citizens for employment in Russia declined dramatically in spring 2020. Here in these graphs, I compared the inflow of migrant workers in the first half of 2019 and 2020. The second quarter of a year is a time of increased inflow because many migrants are in fact seasonal workers. Many of them are circular migrants who come repeatedly every year for seasonal jobs. However, this spring, the inflow declined dramatically, as you see from the below graph, while the demand for workforce in seasonal industries, first of all in agriculture, remained high. Well, please take away. No, let it be. What was the response of migrants who were staying in Russia, often unemployed? Yes, they demonstrated flexibility. Migrants who have lost their jobs in trades, entertainment, or construction went for jobs in labor-demanding sectors. One of them is agriculture. As Saudat mentioned absolutely correctly, it was often unregistered employment. I wouldn't say that it was a massive intersectoral redistribution of available migrant workers, partly because there are some administrative barriers for territorial movement of foreign workforce, but anyhow it took place. Well, there are no reasons to say that Russian agriculture is heavily reliant on foreign labor force. Agricultural sectors which are strongly automated, mechanized, I mean, use different agricultural mechanisms and highly productive machines, harvesters, and so on, like grain growing, for example. They employ mainly local workers, skilled workers. However, labor-intensive sectors like vegetable growing, berries and mushrooms gathering, greenhouse cultivation, they call for additional seasonal workforce, unskilled laborers who are mainly migrants from CIS countries. Usually, the Russian agricultural sector employs approximately 7% of the totality of foreign workforce which stays in the country. It is 300,000 to 400,000 migrant workers in high season. However, this year, many agricultural subsectors face serious challenges. For example, the small fruit crops in southern Russia were only half gathered due to the labor shortage. And
Irina,
vegetable farmers, yeah?
Yeah, can we leave also this part a bit later to talk about deficit of labor and in this area?
Okay.
Yeah, because we have another question that we will we'll ask you to cover this part as well.
Okay, so I will just say a couple of words about, you know, the legal situation of foreign workers who were staying in Russia during the pandemic-related lockdown, of course, was a matter of concern for Russian authorities. Definitely, there was a need for ad hoc political decision in order not to make them fall into irregular status due to expired visas, job permissions, patents, and other documents. And such a decision was taken. Already in March, the Ministry of Internal Affairs issued a special order on legal situation of labor migrants staying in Russia during the pandemic, which included a lot of measures like extension of expired patents without leaving the territory of the Russian Federation, automatic extension of the validity periods of different documents, temporary ban on administrative expulsion, deportation, and readmission for violation of migrant legislation, and so on. And later in April and then in September, these measures were partly confirmed and partly enlarged by presidential decrees. For example, migrant workers were excused from paying the patent monthly fee for 3 months. The validity of different permits was extended again for 3 months and once again for 3 months, so far until the 15th of December. You should admit that it is a substantial support and even more important, attitudes of the state to migration and migrants, even in the difficult times of recession. If you give me a couple of minutes, I will very briefly touch the remittances item, just in the second slide, please, just to show you on the basis of the quarterly, the next one, quarterly data of the, sorry, and one more. You have, very strange. There was another one. Oh, yes, this one. Thank you so much. So this data is based on the quarterly statistics of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation. After sharp decline in amounts of remittances from Russia to Central Asia and other CIS countries, which happened mainly due to declining exchange rate of the Russian currency, and of course, pandemic-related lockdown, already by summer 2020, the remittances showed flow started growing. It contradicts to World Bank estimates presented by Dilip earlier today, but differences between World Bank and national data is a usual matter. So, according to the Central Bank of Russia, in July, remittances went upward even sharper. I think it can be interpreted as a sign of effective adaptation of migrant workers to the pandemic-related recession and their growing incomes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sivachniuk, for complementing the data on remittances and on other information that has been presented. I would now like to turn to Mr. Vasil Kantarji, and I would like to ask what are the main findings of his work related to impact of COVID-19 in Moldova for return migrants. We know that there are many return migrants to Moldova, and did the returnees have any effect on the labor market in general? Because as we know that in light of the adopted pandemic mitigation measures, many migrant workers were forced to remain in their countries of origin, which might result in increased pressure on the labor market and soaring unemployment rates in rural areas. Maybe you could also complement what Ms. Fabiola was mentioning in her presentation. So we would like to hear more about Moldova's case. Thank you.
Thank you, Noard. Hello, everybody, dear colleagues. Thank you, Paolo, for this opportunity. I would refer to these issues more in detail in my further presentation, but for now I will say just the general findings of our surveys. The first one is that as the effect of pandemic, we cannot talk about significant intensification of return of migrants. Particularly, our evidence shows that the number of returned migrants here in Moldova increased if we compare with the similar period with the previous year. In the second quarter, increased just with 15%, and we are talking about around 30,000 of people. So that's not such big number for local market. And also our evidence shows that till the moment, because of we all should understand that no one knows for the moment can anticipate how long will be this pandemic, how long will be this crisis and inaction and the mobility restrictions. So we can speak just what happened till the moment. And here, till the moment in Moldova, there are not evidence to show that the pandemic will significantly impact the migration patterns also. I will present later the more details in that. And I agree with Michael's conclusion that we can speak mostly about something like to put on hold the migration because of COVID, but we cannot speak about the mass returns or intensification of migration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vasil. Now, at the beginning, Mr. Limova wanted to mention also about the remittances, which is a very interesting topic to see. Decline of remittances means that many poor families cannot make their ends meet due to shortage of income during the lockdown. Could you please tell in details the issues related to remittance recipient household members and especially those involved with agriculture? Mr. Limova, the floor is yours. We cannot hear you.
Да, конечно. Да, конечно. Мы переводы ну, в Таджикистане не сократились. В Узбекистане они во втором квартале пошли вверх, но в Таджикистане до сих пор они сокращаются. Мы смотрели, как это влияет на... Ну, в Таджикистане спасение сезонных мигрантов в сельское хозяйство, потому что за вот это вот оставшиеся мигранты резко увеличили посевные площади. У меня было исследование в Исфаинском районе, там распахали еще 15 тысяч гектаров в процессе вот этой деятельности. И несмотря на то, что семьи мигрантов испытывают сокращение потребления, часть переводов идут в сельское хозяйство. Потому что вот оставшиеся сезонники, они распахивают земли, кстати, брошенные, либо второй урожай, третий урожай. То есть вот эти молодые мужчины, они, в общем, пытаются как-то выйти из этого положения и вкладывают те очень небольшие средства, которые их братья или отцы пересылают в сельское хозяйство. Но тут огромное количество проблем. То, что мы увидели в Исфае, невозможно вывести сельхозпродукцию из-за того, что закрыты границы, там склады забиты сухофруктами, они не могут вывести, и неизвестно, как это будет. Поэтому контрабанда, везде разрастается контрабанда. Кроме этого, увеличение натурального хозяйства, то есть люди сеют неэффективные культуры, сажают, а те, которые они могут съесть сами. Поэтому это натуральное хозяйство не очень эффективно, и хорошие земли засеивают ячменем или пшеницей, потому что это обеспечит их семьи на зиму. И очень серьезная проблема, с моей точки зрения, распространение детского труда. Гендерная дискриминация, это понятно, это во всех странах. Но вот то, что мы видим у нас в домохозяйствах мигрантов, вот это сокращение переводов, влияет на то, что дети перестают ходить в школу, потому что денег нет на покупку школьной формы, учебников и оплату обучения. У нас, к сожалению, все это сплошные неформальные платежи. Поэтому идет сокращение посещаемости школы именно в мигрантских домохозяйствах, которые зависят от переводов. И массовое просто увеличение паденщиков. И там и женщины, и дети. То есть те мигранты, которые не смогли даже кусок земли какой-то приобрести или арендовать или что-то, они выходят на случайные заработки, образуются такие базары паденщиков. И это... Ну, я надеюсь, что это будет временно. Но это, кстати, в Узбекистане абсолютно одинаково. Мы там проехали тоже. Вот в Таджикистане, Узбекистане так, в Кыргызстане иначе. Там они перераспределяются не в сельское хозяйство, а в сферу услуг. А сфера услуг тоже остановилась в Кыргызстане, они очень страдают. Что касается Таджикистана и агросектора. Агросектор у нас увеличился, у нас рост на 7% продуктов скотоводства и на 8,9% растениеводства. Экспорт сельхозпродукции увеличился, и это очень-очень помогло экономике в целом. Но очень много проблем для мигрантских домохозяйств. Это проблема знаний, то, о чем говорили, это вот крайне необходимо повысить сельскохозяйственные знания. Проблема с хранением и экспортом продукции. Проблема самая большая, наверное, транспортировка. Пожалуй, это самая большая проблема. И удобрения. Невозможно в республику завести удобрения. Вот, насколько я понимаю, то же самое в Узбекистане, но там более мощная поддержка со стороны государства, чем в Таджикистане. Я не слишком, а то я увлеклась.
No, very, very interesting. And thank you very much for presenting all these issues. It's, of course, sad to know about that it affects a lot children and also their schooling, and also really hoping that this is going to be temporary issues.
Navarre sound.
Yeah, you're muted.
Oh, I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry. Did you hear my response to?
Only
no?
only the first part. Not then you suddenly got muted.
Okay, sorry. So thank you again for the very interesting presentation, Ms. Olimova, and we hope that these issues will be only temporary. Now I would like to ask my last question to Ms. Ivachniuk, it is related to the harvesting season. You started already talking about this, but I had to interrupt you. With the beginning of the harvesting season, the issues of labor supply in the agriculture sector became more evident, specifically for those countries heavily relying on foreign workforce. I'd like to know, were there any labor deficits, particularly for agriculture work? And I'd like you to elaborate more of what you started presenting. Thank you.
Do you hear me now?
Now we can hear you.
Okay. Usually the Russian agricultural sector employs approximately 7% of the totality of foreign workforce. In the high season, it is 300,000 to 400,000 migrant workers. However, this year, many agricultural subsectors, not the totality of agricultural industry, but many subsectors faced serious challenges. For example, the small fruit crops in southern Russia were only half gathered due to the labor shortage. And vegetable farmers desperately called for additional workers for harvesting. So I would say that despite the fact that in general, the Russian agriculture is not so heavily reliant on foreign labor force, but there are some sectors which attract a lot of foreign workers. And I'm to say that there are special quotas in vegetable growing, for example, which are aimed to protect the national labor market. So there is a limit of only 50% of foreign workers which can be employed in vegetable growing. That's my answer. And before quitting from the ekran, I would like to draw your attention that one of the participants of the webinar in the chat mentioned that the numbers from the Central Bank of Uzbekistan also show that from May, the amounts of remittances from Russia to Uzbekistan started growing. So they are more close to the Russian information than that from the World Bank.
Thank you very much for highlighting this, Irina. I just also got information from Vasil that he would add also something to what he presented already. So I would like to pass the floor to Vasil to continue with his presentation and finish what he was talking about in his previous speech. Vasil, yes, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I would mostly refer to the figures and the results of the survey, sociological survey provided for IO Moldova among the returned migrants. The survey population was the people, Moldovan people who had abroad at last 6 months and for now are in Moldova, and they had abroad for the work. But first of all, let's refer to how many of such migrants we have. Generally, we have to divide our migrants into long-term, perfectly integrated in their host countries, and seasonal or circular or short-term migrants that are actually connected to both, to migration and also to the local labor market, if they need that. So the last category is estimated around 250,000 of people, and it's quite stable one from year to year. How many of them returned during pandemic? I already mentioned it increased in second quarter 2020 with 15% if you compare the number with the second quarter of 2019. So the first idea that was large discussed that the pandemic provoke large return of migrants is not confirmed. So let's speak a bit more about these migrants that are in Moldova, but periodically they go to work abroad. Who are them? These people perfectly meet the definition of short-term or circular migrants, because of almost 90% of them have been at last departure for less than 6 months abroad, or between 6 and 12 months. Most of them worked in construction and in households, also perfectly meet the profile of short-term migrants. And a very important figure is that when we ask them why, what are the reasons to return in Moldova, only 22% of them mentioned any COVID-related reasons. Biggest part of them return because of usual reasons, family, it had already planned this return, etc. In the process of return, 60% of them didn't face any problems in returning process. The remaining ones mostly refer to the problem related to restrictions to travel and the restrictions imposed at the borders. And in Moldova, the main problem they face is quarantine. They dislike this 14 days that our authorities imposed to have if you return from abroad. The figure that put us in a conclusion that till the moment the pandemic crisis would not affect substantially the migration process is that biggest part of them, of these short-term migrants, intend, at least in the next 6 months, to re-immigrate, to go abroad for work. And almost 80% of them intend to migrate to the same country and to the same working place as they was at the last departure. So we can conclude that for the moment, most probably the pandemic would not substantially change the migration patterns. As the process, this circular migration is mostly put on the pause, put on the hold, because most of these migrants did not connect it to local market yet. Only 25% of them says that in Moldova, after return, they were looking for a job, and only 22% of them provided any paid works here in Moldova. But we should know that short-term migrants usually are connected to the local market also, and in case the COVID period will be a bit longer, and when they will consume their savings, I think they easily can be connected to the local market. Just 2 things I would like to underline. We have registered a high level of discrimination of migrants at the return because of COVID. Yeah, 20% of migrants saw that they has any discrimination cases. And that is because at the first phase of pandemic in Moldova, the spread of COVID have been strongly associated with return of migrants. And the main negative effect of the pandemic will be not related to migration structure and patterns, but to the level of remittances. Over half of migrants say that their well-being is affected because of COVID, and reported the decrease of household revenues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vasil. And it is really interesting to have these different perspectives and to understand also the results of your work, the service and the research that you did. Now we will have a very short intervention by one of our colleagues, Mr. Dinaliev Marlen. He's from Kyrgyzstan. He's the National Project Coordinator. Since we talked about Central Asia, it would be also good to have the inputs from Kyrgyzstan. So we'll have a very short he will have a very short intervention. So the floor is yours, Marlen.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. So I want to be very short and would like to provide a brief introduction on the situation in Kyrgyzstan in relation to COVID-19 implication and some other mitigation measures which are taking place in Kyrgyzstan by the government. So COVID-19 pandemic unfortunately had enormous implications for all the sectors of the economy. Due to the impact of COVID, GDP has decreased, and it is for the 5 months from January to June, it reached 5.3%. And it's still in the process. By the end of this year, it is estimated it will reach 10 and more %. So as was already mentioned by the previous speakers, GDP highly dependent on external shocks and country vulnerable and rely on remittances, which is around 30%. And it was also mentioned, so I don't want to go into details, it is reduced in terms of remittances as of now by 45%. And as a result, poverty rate is being increased. So it's gonna be estimated that by the end of this year, it will be 10% more. So in total, it's gonna be like 30%. So what measures government are taking in order to respond, and including measures which is also will be supported for returning migrants and their families as part of the COVID-19 impact. To maintain social economic stability, Kyrgyz Authority currently requested already financial assistance for 742 million, out of which about 400 million has been already mobilized. And these funds will be further used for covering public budget gaps and support economic recovery. So some of the measures which are taking place currently, it is a provision of low interest loans. It is about 5 to 7% for the longer period. And it is encouraged to use these funds in the agricultural sector for growing of crops, raising of livestock. And in addition to that, government also supporting with public subsidies as part of the stimulation measures in seed production and knowledge transfer. So summarizing above stated, I would like to highlight that returning migrants should be considered not only from the perspective of creating a challenge, burden for the government, particularly for public social protection system, but also it can be considered as an additional asset. It is an opportunity to use them for social economic reintegration that can bring their investment and new quality of social capital, knowledge, experience, and some other networking contacts. So
thank you, Marlen.
For now, thank you.
Thank you very much, Marlen. It's very interesting to know also Kyrgyzstan's perspective and also the future estimations, the government measures, and very well said about using this as an opportunity as well. So thank you for all our panelists for their very interesting interventions. Now we have very limited time, but we still want to address some of the questions from our attendees. There are a couple of questions that we would like to ask our speakers and panelists to address. And the first question is to Ms. Fabiola Mieres. So the question is the following. Industrial agriculture is dependent on migrant and seasonal labor. What recommendations for governments do you have to enhance human rights of the migrants and agriculture workers, considering that the industrial model is the most supported by public funding, and because of market pressure, this sector degraded human rights and became antisocial? Could you please respond to this?
Thank you for this very easy question. I will be brief, and I would advise the person who posed the question to get in touch by email but basically, we understand the sourcing pressures of the structure of the supply chain of the sector. So that's why it's very important to try to put in place mechanisms that can counteract the squeeze in prices that come from the demand of the sector that then is passed on to the workers. So there's an opportunity for governments to work with their social partners to counteract and design mechanisms where prices can be fair and can translate to better working conditions in terms of not only wages, but housing provisions. So there are different models that can be explored to make the system more sustainable, not only for the economy, but for the workers. And one of the things is to really try to find market mechanisms to counteract the effect of the squeeze in prices that comes from the supply chains and the functioning of the model of agriculture. Thanks. I could talk about hours about this, but that's brief for now.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. And we have another question, and I would like to ask all the speakers and panelists if they would, what they would like to, if they have anything to respond to this. It is directed to all of them. Greetings from FAO Uzbekistan. The question is to the speakers. Would you recommend to governments, what would you recommend to governments in home countries of the migrant workers to start developing programs or new employment opportunities within these countries, or wait for business as usual scenario? We all know that at least one more year will be required to win COVID, given the ongoing second wave, recent one in Russia. So anybody would like to respond? It is not for all of you to respond if you don't have anything, but just giving the opportunity voluntarily to respond to this. Anybody?
Maybe I can start.
Yes, Michael.
Very briefly though, indeed, we see this certainly restrictions in mobility occurring for the foreseeable future. But one thing that I mentioned also in the presentation is developing policies and programs that serve to stimulate economic activity by incentivizing use of savings towards livelihood activities or other investments that migrants or remittance recipients would be interested in doing anyway, either in the short term or further down the field, to encourage them to do it now rather than later. Simple economic stimulus initiatives that don't only rely on public spending, but also incentivize the use of private funds. So a lot of remittance recipients and migrants will use, depending upon what countries you're coming from, but a lot of them will use it towards real estate, towards either purchasing a home or upgrading a home. What policies or programs can you put in place so that they're able to use those savings now, or incentivize them to use those savings now towards those objectives, rather than to use them in the future, so that you're stimulating economic activity within the communities of origin. So programs like that can be supportive to responding to these downturns. But also, as I noted, a need to look at how you safely reopen certain labor migration channels as early as possible. Yes, there will be restrictions to movement for the foreseeable future, but there are also ways to open labor migration opportunities safely in agriculture and in other sectors. So working to see how we can reopen as early as possible in a safe manner can also help to address some of these issues that we're going to be seeing in countries of origin. I referred to in the chat one of IOM's issue briefs. We've issued a number of these briefs on COVID-related topics. So if you go to our website, you can see more. I believe there's an issue brief even precisely on this, on how developing countries can respond to the economic impacts of COVID-19 on labor migration. So I would urge you to also see the website. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for addressing this question. And I also noticed that there are some other suggestions for other briefs, both from IOM, ILO, from FAO. So please make sure to keep an eye on the chat box or on the Q&A box, that you can get more materials from our speakers and panelists. So thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are running out of time and I cannot take more questions. Apologies for this. It is really interesting topic, and of course there is a lot to talk about this, but we don't have that much time. Again, thank you to panelists and speakers, and I want to pass the floor again to Mr. Raimund Jelle to present his concluding remarks. Thank you, Raimund, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Navard. I had some technical problems here because the internet connection seems to be a bit slow. So thank you very much, and it was really very interesting for us in order to see also these different aspects which have been very much highlighted. I was fascinated by the different presentations and the different issues which have been put on the table by also the keynote speakers, as well as also the panelists, bringing very specific aspects into the light of our discussion. I think a couple of conclusion points, and taking also into consideration that we are quite late. This is, of course, not something which is comprehensive and covers everything, but just some elements which I really would like to take us from this discussion, that we definitely have also seen, as it was presented, that the situation for migrant workers in a lot of cases have been also deteriorated. I mean, Mr. Limova was saying at some stage that they are suddenly in their origin places looking for daily labor in order to make a living and to secure the livelihoods. I think the other important aspect, which has been particularly also emphasized with the inputs from Michael, Fabiola, but also Dilip, but also Irina, is that the dependency of both the destination and the original countries is really greater than so far attention has been given to, particularly also in the destination countries. So it is really important, like Michael was emphasizing, that we need to have a greater coordination between the countries of the origin and also the destinations. We have seen this also, that this dependency is not always so far recognized, but with the COVID, it has become to the spotlight. Irina was telling about the case in Russia, southern Russia, for fruits and vegetables, but we have this situation also seen in the EU countries, where suddenly it really became quite important. So I think in this case, it means also, like Fabiola and Dilip has mentioned, that to better integrate the issue of the seasonal workers into the overall policies is a key one, and we have to take care more of the seasonal workers. We have to facilitate at the destination level also systems in order to integrate them more efficiently, in order to really think also about the conceptualization of the skills training, as it was mentioned by Fabiola, and that we really integrate the seasonal workers much better into the policy framework. We integrate it, of course, certainly also much better into the policy framework at the countries of origin. So with this, I would definitely like to emphasize again that I think it was a very interesting discussion, and we are really looking forward to continue the collaboration, but also, of course, putting further emphasis on this work, and particularly let's say the social security, and therefore looking into how to use the agriculture and rural sector in the countries of origin in order to support this is a key one from the perspective of FAO. So I would like to thank you again for your attention, the panelists, keynote speakers for the time, and we're looking forward to continue with our series of webinars. Thank you. Navard, over to you.
Thank you very much, Raimund. I would also like to thank all participants, panelists, and speakers. And also from my side, I would like to thank our communication team, interpreters, and colleagues who worked behind the scenes. I would like to let you know that we will share the link of the recording. You will find it on our website. And please tune in for our next 7th session on food banks and food losses and waste in light of COVID-19. It will take place in 3 weeks' time, and we will notify you about the exact date. It was my pleasure to moderate this session and to talk about a topic that is very close to my heart. So I hope to see you in our next session. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Navard. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you very much for your participation.